Okay, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. I'd like to get started. My name is Ned Dubilo, and as a member of AJC's Executive Council, I'm pleased to welcome you this morning to the Leonard Greenberg Forum for Domestic Policy Issues on the topic of white supremacy in America, confronting our past and shaping our future. Before we begin the program, I want to say a word about Leonard Greenberg, a loved and admired leader of AJC who passed away 2 years ago. Leonard's vision, dedication, and generosity and his profound commitment to American values inspired the thoughtful, centrist advocacy force that we are today. We follow in Leonard's footsteps. If 10, even 5 years ago, you had told me, many of us, that we would be experiencing a renaissance of white supremacist ideology in the United States in 2019, we likely wouldn't have believed you. White-robed Klansmen and skin-headed neo-Nazis seem to be fading artifacts of a shameful past. Today, however, this hateful ideology is back. In this time, and at this time, it's not hooded or hidden. Just over 2 years ago, white nationalist groups marched with their torches through the streets of Charlottesville, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." But this time, they didn't hide their faces. They were not ashamed. White supremacists have committed heinous acts of violence across the United States over the past several years, murdering innocent Americans, Jews, Sikhs, and many others simply for who they are. Today we are joined by 4 experts who will help us understand the sources and the scope of the white supremacist upsurge and provide us with some ideas about how to confront this menace. Tony McAleer serves as co-founder and board chair of Life After Hate. Brian Levin is the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism. Brette Steele serves as the director of Prevention, National Security at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. And Janet Reitman, is a contributing editor for the New York Times Magazine. Our discussion will be moderated by our own AJC's Rabbi Noam Marans, director of Interreligious and Intergroup Relations. Please join me in welcoming our panel, and Noam, the floor is yours. So good morning. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. For this sobering topic of white nationalism, white supremacism, a very important and timely conversation. I think it already had our attention, but if it didn't, this topic arrested our attention once we were able to connect the dots between white nationalism, white supremacism, alt-right, violent extremism from the right, and what happened in Pittsburgh when 11 of our brothers and sisters were mowed down in a synagogue during Shabbat morning prayer, which we commemorated here in honoring the first responders and hearing from Rabbi Myers, and then again in Poway, where there were connections in terms of the rationale of the perpetrators, but we knew about it from Charleston, from Charlottesville, from Christchurch. This topic has arrived front and center. So let's jump right in. I'm going to begin with Janet, who some of you know her, but you don't realize you know her, because she wrote what turned out to be a very prophetic article in the New York Times Magazine section on this topic. You may recall that shortly after Pittsburgh, there was a cover story on white nationalism and white supremacism in the New York Times Magazine. Janet was the author of that. She'd been working on it, and then the Pittsburgh massacre happened, and the report became even more poignant. So Janet, please draw the picture for us of what this phenomenon is about. What are we talking about when we say white nationalism, white supremacism? Janet.
Hi.
You're on.
Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay. No.
Bring it closer.
Sorry about that. A little tired. Right. So I began that piece in the Times based on some other prior reporting that I had been doing on the far-right movement, the neo-Nazi online far-right movement, which had begun to kind of emerge, I began to see after the Trump, right around the sort of the Trump campaign 2015-ish period. And I noticed there was a specific case that I wrote about in which some kids wound up being murdered in Florida by a friend of theirs who had been a Muslim convert who had initially begun as a neo-Nazi. And when the police investigated, they found out that this was actually a small neo-Nazi cell that was part of a larger kind of very diffuse movement called the Atomwaffen Division, which had been started by a 22-year-old guy who was a member of the Florida National Guard. So I'm telling you this long story because so I began reporting on this. And, you know, like I'm somebody who grew up, I'm Jewish, and very, very, very reformed family, grew up not really taking anti-Semitism very seriously, and I was the person that argued with my grandparents about it. And so I then began to, I never experienced it really in my life, you know, married a non-Jew. I'm exactly that person. I'm, you know, the blended family person. So like, you know, the fact that this was going on was really disturbing to me, and I didn't really understand it. So I wound up doing this story about why is it that these kids, these like, you know, 15-year-olds or 17-year-olds or 19-year-olds are being drawn into this hateful movement where they're embracing like Adolf Hitler tropes. And sorry about this. And you know, I was like, how is it that you're even embracing Adolf Hitler tropes? How are you not understanding that, you know, a swastika flag in your room or an SS flag in your room is actually morally repugnant? How are your parents not understanding that this is morally repugnant? So I began to kind of cover this movement through the perspective of very normal people in the suburbs, people that you know, people that your kids go to school with, families that you've been friends with your whole lives, some who may even be partially Jewish, who are not connecting to this kind of undercurrent of hate that's happening in our country, and where it's happening is out of sight. It's happening, not only is it happening on the internet, but it's happening in parts of the internet where you would not know about unless you were kind of in the know. They're you know, sort of sub discussion groups of discussion groups on websites that are so obscure that you might not even know about them. It's not like Breitbart. It's like far, far, far to the right-hand side of something like Breitbart, and then like way down into sort of and often encrypted discussions where you know, kids, because of technology, have been able to access. And so when you're seeing, you know, this is how I began looking at this movement. I began to meet people who didn't even understand that anti-Semitism was really still a thing in this country. They didn't understand how their kids could have gotten into this. One family, who I'm writing about currently in a book I'm working on, the mother, who's like my age, said is I don't even understand. She's like, you know, in the town next door to ours, outside of Boston, there were these swastikas that were written on a car, like on these cars were all defaced with swastikas, and this is after her son, who had been a neo-Nazi, was murdered. She's like, is anti-Semitism really that big of a deal? And I'm like, well, I guess, yes, I think it is, right? So, you know, what I think we're seeing in this country is a very diffuse, fragmented hate. It kind of came to the fore in a place like Charlottesville, in a very in-your-face way, and everybody started getting very alarmed about all these terms: white nationalism, white supremacy, neo-Nazi, alt-right. It's all the same. It's all the same thing. It's rooted in specific, really, antiquated, old ideas that a Zionist organized government, a world global Jewish cabal, a conspiracy of people like George Soros, are secretly pulling the strings on the United States and everywhere else in the West to ultimately weaken, dilute the purity of white people, to cause divisions within European and Western society, to subjugate the world so that their political, financial, social agenda will be achieved. That's what underlies everything. It's a central conspiracy dating back to the 19th century, and every one of these organizations in some way or another believes in that concept that frankly, an evil cabal of Jews is behind everything that's wrong in the world.
Janet, thank you for setting this up. And
It's a very small way of going.
this is not going to be a fun panel.
That bummer over there.
Before I turn to Brian, I also want to welcome all those who are watching us via live stream. This panel was chosen because of its importance, and of course, this filled room is an indication of that. Brian, you're our numbers guy on hate crimes and its relevance to the Jewish community and beyond. What Janet spoke about is not just a story, it is something that has a result. And that result is that hate crimes are on the rise. So please make it simple for us in understanding what we're looking at, first in terms of the numbers, and then perhaps in the breadth and depth, and maybe, if we have time in this round, but later on, some theorizing about causes of what we're witnessing here. Brian.
Thank you so much for inviting me today. I just want to make a note. When I first started getting into this field, among the first folks that mentored me was Ken Stern from the American Jewish Committee, and the friendship has lasted decades. I just met with him in Spokane just a few weeks ago. Thank you so much for having me. One of the things that I think is, for me personally, is putting together reams of data from around the world. It's kind of like being a weather forecaster, but the numbers that are coming in do not look good. And how do we convey cumulatively what these represent? Before I do so, I want to just say that if you are interested in this kind of stuff, follow me on Twitter at Prof. Levin, because I put a lot of the data up and a lot of news stories. And you just have to look at the headlines. Just yesterday, a federal judge threw out the charges against various white supremacists associated with a group called RAM, which we've certainly been monitoring, and we've actually gone to some of these rallies that were mentioned in the, against the Nazis, by the way, in the federal papers. What else is in the headlines? Some politicians are saying that Congressman Steve King should not be censured or punished. And that just came out in Politico today. So every day there's something happening. Let me try and put together a couple of thoughts for you. The first thing I would say, if you had to come up with a couple of words to describe what's going on, I'd say fragmentation and ecosystem. And here's what I mean. We are in an extraordinarily fragmented time sociopolitically. And you can look at Pew, which shows we're not only more polarized than we've been in decades, we're more entrenched in that polarization. And there's data on that, but we don't have time to go into that. What else are we seeing? Something really interesting. with my colleague Jim Nolan from West Virginia University, and I always say go Mountaineers because he's so helpful, and my colleagues at the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, we disaggregated over a quarter century worth of FBI hate crime data. And when you do that, it's actually very good. Listen to this. The 5 worst months before the last couple of years for anti-Semitic hate crime in the United States all came around disputes between Israelis and Palestinians. So if you look at the 5 worst months, and the worst month, by the way, I believe was October 2000. However, you also have to break down the data another way. Traditionally, it used to be that when Jews would be victimized in hate crimes, that it would generally be criminal mischief, threats, things like that. We're seeing a change in that, much more violent. So, for instance, last year, another organization found that assaults against Jews were up 105%. And we've been seeing these increases around the world. And we've also been seeing an increase generally, except a couple of countries. You know, sometimes it bounces around the top a little bit, across Europe as well with regard to hate crime, and anti-Semitic hate crime in particular. New data. You haven't seen it anywhere else because we haven't printed it up yet. We looked at 30 major cities across the United States in 2018. Listen to this. If you would have asked me last June what was going on with hate crime in the United States in the major cities that we were looking at, I'd say hate crimes have declined by double-digit percentages. Except guess what happened? The second half of the year. So cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles went from significant declines to increases. And what we've seen is this is the 5th consecutive increase in these cities, and it's the first time this decade that these numbers hit over 2,000. So to put that in perspective, last year there were over 7,000 hate crimes throughout the whole country, according to the FBI. In just these 30 cities, we hit over 2,000. So based on our analysis, there's an 80% chance that when the FBI comes out with their hate crime data right before Thanksgiving, that we're going to see the 4th consecutive annual increase. And for anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic hate crimes, and I'm talking about police data, we are seeing a little over 9% increase in 10 of the focus cities. And in New York City, over half the hate crimes last year were anti-Semitic. And we have an increase in New York this year. LA is down with hate crimes, but you got to look at the full year. Really important, politics. It is playing a role. There is now an ecosystem with social media and with politics that is entrenched white nationalism, and it is entrenched around the world. Just a couple of quick points, because I think these are really important. Our friends at Southern Poverty Law Center, disclaimer, 20 some odd years ago I had the honor of working there. They have showed a record number of hate groups in 2018, 1,020. But also, in the 2.5 years leading into and just after Charlottesville, we saw more mega, not MAGA, mega rallies of white nationalists in public than we've seen easily in the previous 10 to 15 years. The night before Charlottesville would have been the largest rally that we've seen in decades. The next day, there were twice as many, 500 to 600 people. And let me tell you what else. We're seeing politics play a role in this. Well, at least correlate. Give you an example. In the past, we saw a hate crime spike around terrorist attacks, around police use of force, things like that, news events. Now we're seeing it occur around political events. November 2016, FBI data disaggregated, was the worst month for hate crime in 14 years. You have to go all the way back to the first anniversary of 9/11. And the day after Election Day, November 10th, 2016, was the worst day for FBI hate crime going back to June 2003. And we also had a bomb plot that was scheduled that day to blow up a predominantly Muslim apartment complex in Garden City, Kansas. In addition, we're seeing an increase of hate speech on the internet. But it's not just an increase, there's been a migration to what I'm going to call affinity platforms. So as we ban folks from Twitter and Facebook, it's not like they don't have their own place to go. They're just segregating their own island of an echo chamber. And there are consequences to that too. So bottom line is, the fragmentation that we're seeing with respect to our socio-political situation is allowing extremism to bubble up because there's fear of change. And what is happening is the bigots now are changing their tune. Instead of using a swastika, they're saying identitarianism. And they're changing their tactics. So what has happened since Charlottesville is we've seen a decline in the number of large white nationalists and related rallies. But in any other year, like 2018, 150 people showing up at a Patriot Prayer thing would be a big deal. Now it's actually a decline. And what we've been seeing, though, and this is what I told Janet, is we've seen a migration over to the internet. And what is happening is we have to watch out, not just for these groups, but for these loners who are now part of a community that spans geography, but also time. Because what they are now doing, bear with me, this is my final thing. When I interviewed a skinhead 27 years ago, and he comes to my class and things like that, said, we would do these things called propaganda of the deed. We'd boot somebody, and that would show, go out, our fellow travelers, and beat up a Jew. Now it's propaganda of the deed 2.0, where they want to live stream their attacks. Last year was the worst year for anti-Semitic homicides that we've ever seen. And the only thing that stopped this year from being worse was the fact that a violent anti-Semites gun jammed. We've also seen more attacks against houses of worship across the world, and it's diversifying with regard to geography and with regard to faith. So the bottom line is that the data is coming in, it doesn't look good, and I think we have to be worried about the coming political season because recent surveys showed that people are more engaged in this political activity that's going on, and they're engaged earlier. And what we're seeing is hate crimes increasing around these political events. Closing 2018, this isn't FBI data, this is police data. If you drew a line going from Orange County, California, straight across the country, a lot of the major cities above that line showed increases in hate crime around election time. Below that, not so much. So the blue cities are getting hit because these folks want to target people where they think that the liberals and the Jews and other folks live. So bottom line is the trend is up, but it is not only white nationalism that is affected by this. It's like when I was watching the Detroit Grand Prix over the weekend. When a car spins out because of the rain, it'll hit other race cars. And what I'm saying is you will see not only an increase in this white nationalist activity, but also as other extremists take their cues and also will respond. So when we have these kinds of fragmentation and conflict, it affects hate crime as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Such a happy time. So we're behaving now like social scientists. It's now important to make it real. And Tony can make it real for us because Tony lived inside this world and left this world, the world of hate, and dedicated his life to combating it and bringing people out of the world of hate. Tony, what does this world look like up close?
Thank you. I think I just want to say it's not all gloomy. That I'm hopeful, and the work that we do at Life After Hate is cause for hope. So it's not all gloom. But when I look at my time inside the movement, which was about 15 years, We were a bunch of vulnerable young men, you know, that were sort of bound by our wounds, by our anger, and we found common cause in the white supremacy and this idea of you know, the Jewish cabal, the Zionist occupation government, and all of that. But when we peel back the layers, you know, with the work we do at Life After Hate, we find vulnerable human beings. Once we pull back those labels, and I think and behind that vulnerability is toxic shame, a struggle to find out who they are in this world, and I'm not making excuses in any way, but you know, when we look at the young men that took part in the ISIS attacks in Paris and Brussels, we found the same thing. They weren't Islamic scholars. They were young men with drug histories and criminal records and things like that. And so we have to reconcile with that. And so in my time in the movement, you know, when you talk about how do people believe these tropes and things like that, and the ideology itself is not what draws people in. It's the sense of purpose, sense of meaning, sense of belonging, sense of community that comes along with that ideology. And I remember after Charlottesville, we got a letter from a mother who said, my son's 18, he's got Asperger's syndrome, and he's up to his eyeballs in this white nationalist stuff, and I'm really concerned. She said, but what really concerns me the most is those white nationalists have embraced and accepted my son in a way that no one has in his entire life. And I would say that he would probably believe the earth was flat if that's what it took to get that type of attention, acceptance, and approval. And you know, a lot of what I see going on today is, you know, with these young men and increasingly women, it's kind of counterculture. Because it's morally repugnant to you, it's attractive to them because they're angry and they're peed off. My father, who we became estranged during my time in the movement, he was bombed by the Germans during World War II in Liverpool. And I had a picture of the guy who sent the bombs on my wall. It's an interesting way to be angry at your father. But I think we need to humanize what this problem is, not just write them off, because we can bring them back. I don't believe anybody is irredeemable, in the words of our executive director, Sammy Rangel. And I believe that the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is a mirror reflection of how disconnected and dehumanized we are. And I think at Life After Hate, we're not the only solution, but we are part of the solution to heal those people that are full of hate, anger, and violence.
Thank you, Tony. Tony and Brette are testifying later today at the House Oversight Committee on this exact topic. So we're getting a preview, perhaps, of what they may be sharing more publicly, and we're glad that they're both here together with our other panelists. Brette, we're angry because we want our government to do something. We want our government to protect us. I'm learning that that's not necessarily the best question, because it's complicated. You worked at Justice and at Homeland Security. You're now a researcher in the field. Tell us what the political challenges are here. The more I read, the more I realize that there are political footballs that are involved in this topic on the right and the left that may be preventing, in the American context, the kind of things that we instinctually want from our government. So introduce us to the world of law in the context of white nationalism.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today at the AJC conference. Thank you for having me. As the rabbi mentioned, my background, I spent several years coordinating terrorism prevention for the Department of Justice. I served as Deputy Director of the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force and Regional Director of the Office of Terrorism Prevention Partnerships. So it was my job to figure out what to do about everything that terrifies all of us for good reason, right? Now I'm at the McCain Institute. One correction, I am not a researcher. We consider ourselves an action tank rather than a think tank, and so I am designing programs similar to what I was doing in government, designing programs to address these issues head on. Now, I will say, although often it looks like nothing is happening, there is a lot happening at the government level. It's not an all bad news story, but there is absolutely more that can be done. So I'm going to take a moment to give you a snapshot in what's been done to date, and then we'll focus on what types of solutions I will be advocating before Congress this afternoon. So first of all, when I was in my government roles, addressing domestic terrorism and violent white supremacy was one of my highest priorities. Historically, federal departments and agencies had a community awareness briefing on people traveling overseas to join ISIS. And it was our Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, before she became Attorney General, saying, we need one of these for domestic terrorism, we need one of these for violent white supremacy. And that was my first priority when I took over the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force as Deputy Director, was to create that community awareness briefing that we've done in houses of worship, including synagogues across the country, was to create that briefing for domestic terrorism and violent white supremacy. Similarly, we had community resilience exercises, tabletop exercises, that we can sit down and do with communities. If you see someone, if a mother sees her son spending all day on Daily Stormer, how does she know where to go? How does she know who can help? And how does the community know how to mobilize resources so that that young man gets the support he needs, rather than continuing down that potentially violent path? And so we created those community resilient exercises for violent white supremacy, sovereign citizen, other forms of domestic terrorism as well. And then I worked with local partners, especially when I was regional director for the Department of Homeland Security. I brought out Tony and introduced him to local partners in Los Angeles County, in Orange County, in San Diego County, where we have a lot of challenges in this space. And help those local partners build the capacity so that when those parents have those concerns, they knew where to go. Because in 80% of cases, someone knows something. More often than not, the people who are in the best position to see behavior change over time are your parents and your peers. They do not want to get people they love in trouble. So what we need to build are compassionate solutions where parents and peers are willing to reach out and get someone they love help. And so that's what we've been trying to build, is the capacity of prevention professionals, mental health professionals, social workers, educators, to provide that help, to be that resource for those parents and those friends who are looking for a lifeline for someone they care about, to get them help. So that's what we were doing while I was in the government and what the government continues to do. It's not nothing, but more can be done. So what more can be done? First, Brian has done an excellent job disaggregating FBI hate crime data. The reality is that data could be a lot better than it currently is. So FBI receives reports, they receive voluntary reporting from local law enforcement jurisdictions across the country. They do not receive complete reporting. They received reports last year or 2017, they haven't gotten to last year yet, over 7,000 hate crimes. A different component of the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, estimates that number at closer to 200,000. So, of those 200,000, that's people self-reporting when they believe they've been victimized. Less than 50% of them report to law enforcement. We need better reporting to law enforcement. We need better training for law enforcement of how to investigate and report hate crimes. And we need potentially to consider mandatory reporting of that data so that we're not dependent on the voluntary decisions of 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies around the country. Second, I mentioned the prevention work I was doing. 2 years ago, the resources devoted to prevention in this country, you're going to think this number is low, but just hang on because it's going to get worse. 2 years ago, the amount of money devoted to prevention in this country from the Department of Homeland Security was $21 million, and that included $10 million in grant funding. Right now, that office has been reorganized 2 times in the last 2 years. Their budget is down to just $2.6 million with 0 in grant funding. I told you it's going to get worse. Okay, so we need to scale up that support. The office had gone from 16 full-time personnel and 25 contractors to just 8 full-time personnel. We need to better resource these efforts, and we need to create grants for programs like Life After Hate, like these different prevention models that we're seeing crop up around the country that are currently working on the lint in their pockets. So that's second. Third, we've seen different approaches to terrorism in this country legally. Okay? The reality is the code, the United States Code, treats domestic terrorism differently than it treats international terrorism. There is a definition of domestic terrorism in a code, but there is not a charging statute that corresponds with that definition, and I apologize for being a lawyer. I will try to make this simple. If you are using a gun, like we saw in Tree of Life or Poway, if you're using a car, like we saw in Charlottesville, to violently kill people in order to cause fear and coercion, there is no terrorism charge in the United States Code. Now, if you use that same gun or that same car to violently cause fear and coercion on behalf of the Islamic State, there is a terrorism charge. Okay? And that's the final thing I'll be advocating before Congress today. We need the code to reflect the conduct and not the ideology behind that conduct.
Brett. As always, we're racing for time in these panels, and I'm conscious of time, and I'm going to do some quick follow-ups, and then we're going to go to questions because I suspect there are several hundred questions here, but we're only going to take, 4 or 5 of them at a time. I want to stay with Brett for a moment and push you just a bit. Can you unpack this for us in terms of the political left and the political right? How much of this is about free speech? How much of this is about a concern that the phrase right wing may be interpreted too widely? I hope I'm asking the question well. If not, answer the way it should be answered.
So that was my advice for Congress today. Answer the question you wish you were asked, not the question you were asked, right? So there are challenges across the political spectrum. I don't want to lay these challenges on any one point. The reality, when you argue for example, for a domestic terrorism statute, there are concerns that that could be used to target civil rights and civil liberties groups, like the days of COINTELPRO and the targeted surveillance on Martin Luther King, and that's certainly not an era we want to repeat. And so there are concerns about misuse of authorities. I'm not arguing for any additional investigative authorities, just a statute that aligns with that definition that already exists in the United States Code. There are also protections for First Amendment protected speech. And domestic terrorism cases are some of the hardest cases to predicate. Predicate is the word we use to kind of establish that case within the FBI because of these First Amendment protections. So you have arguments across the spectrum that make domestic terrorism more difficult. I will never forget, I had to go before Congress, before Chairman Grassley's staff when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And he wanted to know why, when I was at the Department of Justice, why we were investing money on far-right violence. That was the grant. The very next sentence in the grant, this was a research grant, was racially motivated violence. And violence, okay? That's the focus. Not belief, violence. And we did that briefing at 6 o'clock that night. That was the night of Charleston and that shooting. And so time and time again, people say this isn't a problem. And unfortunately, we have evidence just piling up of how big of a problem it is. But there are challenges across the spectrum.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to now turn to the audience, but I reserve the right to ask some more questions of my own to get to topics that we haven't heard about yet. I'm going to go one from over there, one from the middle, and one from over here. The young woman, I'm going to use young. There you go. And could you stand up, please, and tell us your name and where you're from, and then ask your question?
Sure. Meryl Spiegelman from Miami, Florida. What responsibility, if any, or what involvement do the schools have in identifying and, I don't want to say rooting out, because they have so much on their plate, so they can't do everything. And I speak from experience. My daughter, this was 10 years ago, was a victim of anti-Semitic hate language and on a bus to school, her bus to school. My nephew, as recently as a year ago, was a victim of bullying, anti-Semitic bullying, where they took his picture, photoshopped a picture of Hitler on top of him, and sent it around on the internet. And different schools, even within the same school system, have different policies. And I don't know what we can do as parents, because in most instances, a lot of these kids, and these were in middle schools, the parents have no idea. You know, they're just disconnected from what their kids are doing. And in many instances, we found the principals, their hands are tied with what they can do.
Thank you. And good role modeling on getting to a question. We appreciate it. Everyone follow that example. My friend over here, that's you, raise your hand. There you go. Please stand up. Tell us who you are. Panelists, you do not need to answer every question. Please take note of where your expertise is and jump in when we get to the answers.
I didn't expect to address this concern again this weekend. I had thought of this.
What is your name, by the way?
I'm Joel Negrin from Westchester, New York.
Thank you, Joel.
I was concerned when I saw the Arab panelists, and I didn't expect to have this concern again. Why are you not concerned for your own personal safety?
Okay, we're going to take one more over here, please.
Mickey Simon from Philadelphia. In southeastern Pennsylvania, we had this past year we had a big changeover in Congress. And on behalf of AJC, we undertook to meet with as many of the new legislators as we could. And in the materials that AJC prepared. The pending legislation about mandatory reporting was something that we tried to get the new Congress people to adopt. My question is, why do you believe there has been such a problem with getting local authorities to report? Is it definitional? Is it they don't want to spend the money? Is it because they don't believe they have a problem? And secondly, flowing from that, if you were to get the mandatory reporting, and in fact, in this day and age, if they did what the law required them to do, which so many people don't do, what do you think the result of that mandatory reporting will be on the numbers?
Okay, thank you. We have schools, meaning education and bullying. We have the personal safety of our panelists and the issue of mandatory reporting. I'm going to help curate a little bit. Janet and Tony, the personal safety issues, please.
I'm so sorry about my microphone issues here. It is closed, right? Sorry. So I've been reporting on terrorism and extremism since I covered wars and conflicts overseas in the Middle East and elsewhere, and I've been covering the post 9/11 stuff since the 2009-10, and sorry, and so I have received death threats since 2012, since the Boston bombing. I wrote an article for Rolling Stone about Jahar Tsarnaev, and I bring this up because this is really, really important in the conversation about any form of extremism. Jahar Tsarnaev was a Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts-based kid who grew up. He came from the Caucasus. When he was a very little boy, he was an American citizen. He was almost an American citizen. He was a legal resident, and he was a college student. And he looked exactly like anybody else. Basically, he's a white kid. He looked like any other nice, cute, personable white kid, which is what he was. And we put him on the cover of Rolling Stone to show America that terrorism and extremism happens right next door in our communities, in our schools, and that we need to recognize it, and we need to contend with it, and we need to look it in the face and own it as our own problem, whether we're talking about Muslims, whether we're talking about white Christians, whether we're talking about anybody, any extremist, whether we're talking about just open and out racists. It's part of who we are as America. We're a polyglot society. This is who we are. This is part of us, right? As a result of our putting Jahar on the cover, he happened to be very handsome, so he looked a little bit like Jim Morrison. I received death threats. We had to call in private security. I had to call in the New York City Police Department. Somebody created an entire website targeting me as a Jew. As I just told you, I'm not a very observant one. So they somehow just, and Jan Wenner, who is the owner and publisher of Rolling Stone, of course, he also even less of an observant Jew than me. It was really astonishing. So I've been dealing with this for many, many years, and at this point in time, I just think that I don't provoke these people. I ignore them. I don't think that after that kind of initial scare, I just decided that, frankly, I'm just going to go ahead and do my job and do it as well as I possibly can. And I don't tweet very often. I tweet to promote my own work, I have to say, because it's kind of part of your job when you're a reporter, to get people to read you. But I don't engage. I have friends who cover extremism, and they love to engage with people. I don't do that. I don't. I've been writing. I got to tell you, I've been writing a book, so I have 3 hours of sleep right now, and all I do is write and think and read. And I'm not out there talking about this stuff. I'm not out there doing all this stuff. And I think that's the way to protect yourself, frankly, is just keep your head down, do your work, focus on the task at hand. Be aware, confront, confront in your own heart, if not in your own voice?
Tony, is safety an issue in your work?
Nothing to see here. Just move along, everybody.
No, I'd like to echo those statements as well as, being provocative and engaging in a non-constructive way online can exacerbate that problem. For myself, we're beyond that. We're not in a time of half measures, and in confronting what we have to confront requires great courage, and we can't allow fear to win the day. As human beings, we come from one of two places: operate love or fear, and we need to come from a place of love. We need to be good bystanders and upstanders and intervene and confront this with great courage. It's going to take great courage. It's doable, but it's going to take great courage. I also have a great coach and mentor that makes sure, he holds me accountable to the communities that I've harmed, and I hold myself accountable to the communities that I've harmed. So I have to put that first rather than worry about my own public safety, this work that I do. And we encourage the young men and women that we help to not just leave those movements behind, but to talk about their experiences, to engage in the communities that they've once harmed. And when that happens, there's a healing that happens on both sides. So the work that I do, this is my tshuva. This is the work that I have to do, and I'm not going to let any fear or threats get in the way.
Thank you very much, Tony. Mandatory reporting. I'm going to go first with Brette, and then if Brian has something to add. Brette, please.
So Brian probably has as much, if not more, to say about this than I do. Why is it so difficult, I believe, was the question. The reality is local law enforcement need more guidance on what to report, how to report it. If they don't have a state hate crime law, they're not sure whether or not something is included. We need better guidance, better training for local law enforcement. There's also concerns about what message are you sending if your numbers are high. I'm going to let Brian dig into that further, but there's a lot of ambiguity. I mean, Heather Heyer's death in Charlottesville was not counted as a hate crime. There is a lot of inconsistency, a lot of ambiguity in those reporting standards. So even if we had mandatory reporting, I start with the training because mandatory reporting alone is not enough.
And even without Heather's murder not included, along with the other injuries, Charlottesville was tied for the second worst month for hate crime in about a decade, give or take. Interestingly, talk about politics, for instance, October 2008, when it appeared that the first African-American president was going to be elected, was the highest month. I think we had like 722 or something like that month. Then November 2016, and then we saw again, not with FBI data, but with our city data. Just we had someone from Miami. Don't worry about anything. You haven't had a reported hate crime in the city of Miami this decade. 2018, though, we had 10. New Orleans had one in 2017. They had 11. So we have something that we call reporting effect. And we do certainly think for some of the cities, and we put it in our report, for some of the cities, the increase is going to be due to what we call reporting effect. But the nice thing about FBI data, it gets a lot of flack, but it's very good for determining trends, and particularly trends with regard to different groups. What I would say to folks about doing things, first of all, do something, because you have a power far greater than any of us in that you're in the local community. And one of the things that we're seeing for those places that have reported this, for instance, we took about 30 cities. 47% of 14 hit decade highs. Chicago, Los Angeles, etc. Some of the places that haven't been counting a lot, we've seen increases as well. But what I've asked California to do, and you can do the same in your state, find out who's covered under your hate crime law. Does it exclude gay people? Does it exclude the homeless? Does it exclude transgendered people? And if it does, call your legislator. They respond to you more than they respond to me. The other thing is, even if you don't have mandatory reporting, we need policies. One of the things that I asked the California legislature to do, and much to my surprise, well, my rabbi said, wear a yarmulke when you go, and they passed it. One of the things that we asked them to do, doesn't happen that easily usually. You'll see that today, right? One of the things that we I left mine in California. Well, one of the things that we asked them to do was to do an audit and see what do police departments do. And what we found is a lot of these places didn't have model policies, they didn't have training, they didn't have a message from the top. And that applies to schools too. And these can be used as catalysts for change. But a lot of times those catalysts will come from the community. Look at your state's hate crime law. I'm happy to help. Follow me at Prof. Levin, because one of the things that I want to do is, if the Nazis can use the internet, so can we. And what I try to do is put data and legal stuff up there so that you all can see it, and then go to your state legislators, go to your Congress people, and say, these things are important.
During this pause for a moment, I want to alert our panelists that in a moment I'm going to ask you to be empowering. You've already begun to do that. Think about telling our friends here the one thing that they can do to be a force for good and change in this entire topic. It shouldn't be all doom and gloom. It should be also actionable. And in that context, I want to mention that, of course, AJC is very involved in this issue. It's a key issue for us. It's emanating on the program side from, among other places, our Muslim-Jewish relations work, because this is an issue for our Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council, which is very focused on hate crimes. The Director of U.S. Muslim-Jewish Relations is here. Ari Gordon, can you just wave? Okay. And his partner in this, Natalia Mahmoud, is not here because she is observing the Muslim Eid, an important member of our team. And they are mentored in part by Mark Stern. Mark, I believe you were here, AJC's General Counsel. And it's operational, including implicitly today on Capitol Hill by Julie Raymond and her team. This is not just an intellectual exercise for AJC. This is real, actionable material. Before we go to questions, I want to do this fast round, beginning with Janet and moving to her left. Schools.
I can talk about education.
Janet's going to do education, she promises. And I think there was at least one reference to education, but I know we could even benefit on this panel from an educator as well. But go ahead, Janet.
So I think that to get to education and everything, the whole thing here is to just hold people accountable. Hold your principals at your schools accountable. Hold your friends accountable. Make sure that people don't forget that this is actually a serious problem. Become aware of what's going on the internet. Educate yourself. It doesn't mean that you have to spend your time on the Daily Stormer, but you should become aware that maybe your children are, if you have kids that are gamers, chances are they've encountered really noxious speech because it's all over gaming sites. If you have kids that, like to go on 4chan, for example, chances are they've encountered, 4chan is a sea. It's like a city that is dominated, run by, and for adolescents. And there are some very noxious and very strategic characters that hang out there. This is part of what I report on. Spell it, please, 4chan, 4, C-H-A-N. It has a spin-off called 8, the number 8, C-H-A-N. You will not understand these sites. I don't. I find it really, really offensive to go on them, to be honest. If you're over the age of 30, you're not going to, if 25 probably, you're really not going to like it. But your kids or your grandkids are hanging out in these kinds of spaces, and you need to understand that and not just, if you're a parent who doesn't know what your kids are doing, you should know what your kids are doing. No, it's not. That's not to say you don't know what your middle schoolers are doing. That's your fault. Try to understand what they're doing. That's the only way that you're going to be able to prevent this.
Tony.
In this time of great division and polarization in this country, like I said before, human beings come from one of two places. We can come from fear, or we can come from love. And we have to come from love. And love, I'm not talking about the romantic feeling and notion. I'm talking about a state of being. I'm talking about compassion. And this society needs to become more compassionate. And we have to inspire people with every action of every moment of every day that we take in order to inspire people around us to be compassionate. Because compassion in the end will win. But we can't leave it to other people. We have to become more compassionate in every moment of every day.
Brett?
Get involved. Take ownership of this issue. This isn't just for the people on the stage. This is for everyone. We need a whole of society response to prevent a problem this huge. So get involved. John McCain, after Charlottesville, said all Americans need to unite against hatred and bigotry. I'm calling on all of you to do that here today.
Brian.
Leadership starts in your town. When President Bush spoke 6 days after 9/11 about tolerance with respect to Muslims, hate crimes dropped against Muslims and Arabs by 2/3 the next day and 2/3 the next year. After my community was hit by a terrorist attack, we saw an increase in hate crimes against Muslims and Arabs. Candidate Trump at that point, 5 days later, proposed his Muslim ban. Hate crimes against Muslims and Arabs increased by almost 24%, above the spike that we saw from the terrorist attack in the next 10 days or so. You can make a difference in your community. You can take the bully pulpit. Your principal can take the bully pulpit. Your state senator, your mayor. In San Bernardino, after our attack occurred, we didn't have a single hate crime in the city of San Bernardino because we all came together. And what I would say, just bear with me on this one. Reach out to people you may not normally reach out to. And especially the interfaith community and people of goodwill across the political spectrum. What I do at my universities, I invite conservative people of goodwill. I invite interfaith so people can engage and critically ask questions in a circumstance where they don't feel that they don't understand difference. And that's important because we fear what we don't know. And we just saw, listen to this, a survey out of a European group that surveyed Americans and found a disturbing level of ignorance among American adults about the Holocaust, people who can't even identify Auschwitz, and among millennials, it was double. Education and outreach.
They only educate about the Holocaust, by the way, in 7, it's only mandatory in 7 of our 7 U.S. states, and they're the states with the most Jews.
And Oregon just did it. Oregon just passed something.
That's it. So, okay, 8.
So we have time for 1, maybe 2 more questions. Lots of hands. We're going to take a question here in a moment. We'll get the microphone to you. And I'm looking for a male on this side. There you go. Wave at me so you got me. So my friends will bring the microphone to you. Please stand, name, location, please very briefly.
Terry Shiner. I'm a lawyer and a social worker from Port Washington, New York. I heard you say that you bring in social workers, mental health workers, and you see it as a problem of alienation, like a social mental health problem. And I'm wondering to what extent that becomes a double-edged sword. Because while it brings in the idea of compassion to try to understand where that person's coming from, if you tell them that their ideas are coming because they are not well adjusted or they're mentally ill, that's kind of provocative as well. So how does that work?
Thank you. And you're going to have the last question, my friend. Please identify yourself.
My name is Imam Salam Muqsin from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I want to say hi to shout out to my brother Ari, Rabbi Ari.
Bring the mic closer to your mouth, please. Thank you. There you go.
Okay. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Imam Salam Muqsin. To have a discussion about white supremacy, and you don't have an African American up there, you don't have a Latino up there, one is the lack of insight, because you're looking at a problem about arresting something which is not the cause. You have to find patient zero. And I talked about this yesterday in one of the sessions. Invisible white supremacy by a visibly whitened God. Imagine if the Jews had been under 302 years of slavery, 89 years of Jim Crowism, and they had to put the cross around their neck symbolized in the swastika, and then have Hitler as their Lord and Savior. You don't even know how the African American had to make this journey in coming outside of, thinking outside of white supremacy. And so therefore you have a whole void of information that you are not in touch with. And it's a shame because really we have had to find our own selves. No Africans came for us, no Arabs came for us. You don't see me looking like an Arab, though I'm a Muslim. How do you remain your independence? How do you keep a flag right here and Holy Quran right next to it? You don't have none of that insight because you are not really engaging the kind of intercourse between the cultures and have more interfaith dialogue. The Jews in Philadelphia gave me an iftar at the Jewish Museum. We way down the line. The Jews in Philadelphia this year gave me an iftar at the synagogue. You have to exercise relationships. This sister right here talked about her daughter. What you have to do is put education as a top priority because people are the lack of knowledge. You fly your planes by the Arabic numeral system. You do your math by the Arabic numeral system. There was a time that the Muslims led in Spain in knowledge. But we don't know this stuff. There's so much boogeyman falsehood in our educational system. Columbus discovered America. BS. You understand? And so we have to get back to be the enlightened ones. We're so, listen, I go in the masjid in the mosque, you hear 5 different languages. And 4 of them might be dark as me. But we're so drunk at one time, we only thought one language. And now we're in a multicultural society and we're behind the human evolution movement. And so now we have to get back to education, validity, in terms of each individual standing on their own merits and the contributions that they've made. And then we start the process of arresting those who are in a situation of causing trouble.
Thank you.
That's all.
Thank you, Imam, for your connection, for your constructive criticism, comment, and your connections with AJC. You can address that comment and the question, which was about labeling this as a mental health issue and whether it's productive or not. I'm not going to overly curate, but maybe Tony and Brett, I think Brett mentioned it as well. Let's start with Brett and then go to Tony. Janet, you jumping in on this one?
Sure.
Well, good, but we have to do this each in 30 seconds each because I have a boss and wants you at the plenary. Go ahead.
All right, so you're absolutely right that the more we label and stigmatize individuals involved in this movement, the harder it is to address and prevent it. Historically, it's actually not a mental health issue. Empirically speaking, it's a relatively low proportion of the people involved. Everyone, however, can benefit from some mental health support, independent. I'm not saying mental illness, I'm saying cognitive behavioral therapy. So historically, it's how do we reach out to parents to help their children, whether that's through mentoring, after-school programming. It can take any number of forms. The traditional school toolkit for social workers. It's not about stigmatizing the individuals involved.
Tony.
I agree. It's not a mental illness or anything like that, and we shouldn't call it that. Since Charlottesville, we've had 241 people reach out to us. Half of them are families concerned for loved ones, and the other half are individuals seeking help. 45 in the last 3 months since Facebook has been redirecting to us, and those families need support. That's a whole other type of counseling issue that requires a particular skill set to help them deal with what families problems in the family. And we look at this as it's not the only antisocial expression that is coming with a young person. We may be recognized and be alarmed most by the expression of white supremacy, but we see a lot of other expressions that also indicate that the person's a little bit troubled.
Janet, you can have the last word.
So I want to applaud you, sir. I agree with you because I have an issue. What I was asked to speak about initially was to make sense of all these terms: white nationalists, white supremacists, and I told him I couldn't because really we are, and this is controversial or not, we are a white supremacist country. We're structurally built on white supremacy. We are a structurally racist nation. It's who we are. Okay, and so every institution in the society has been built to benefit white people, including Jewish people, because European people, and I think that we need to kind of get beyond, a concept of othering people as white supremacists as well as terrorists, because the use of the word terrorist has been used to specifically target groups of people, specifically Muslim people. But you know what? The Ku Klux Klan were like the worst terrorist group in the history of pre-20th century America, and actually during the mid-20th century. I think that we need to kind of come up with ways of looking at the problems in our country and looking at each other exactly right through a position of education rather than through these kind of hot-button terms. And that really what they do is they serve to divide and fragment and sow hate and distrust between us.
A big thank you to Brian and Brette and Tony and Janet for educating, inspiring, and calling us to action.